and it's a pleasure to welcome you to another iteration of Fearless Females. I want to thank the program in Women and Gender Studies at ASU for supporting this, and Project Humanities as well. This is an unusual iteration of Fearless Females for two reasons. One is that we are introducing to you in a formal way a new series of books that we started publishing last year, historical fiction, and we published those under the imprint of Bagman Books. And secondly, this is the first time that the speaker will be talking about a fictional person, although there could be historical antecedent for Freawaru, we just don't know. She's mentioned one time in world literature in line 2022 of the poem Beowulf. Those of you who don't know Beowulf, how many of you don't know Beowulf? Some of you don't. It's a poem written sometime between 516 and 1035. We don't know the precise date. We don't know where it was written. We don't know why it was written. We don't know who wrote it, and we don't know the audience for the poem. But it's one of the most magnificent monuments of world literature, and since its first discovery in 1786, it was buried in a manuscript in the British Museum, and subsequent publication in the first edition in 1815, it's gone through 32 editions of the poem itself. An edition of the poem is the original language poem with critical apparatus, notes, introduction, glossary, all of that sort of thing. And the most recent edition is one that it's this thick. This is it. Came out in 2008 that I did with two colleagues of mine, one at Indiana and one at Wisconsin. The poem has also been translated into 29 languages, including Arabic and Chinese. The Beowulf diaspora is just enormous, and the number of novels that have been written about Beowulf is fairly large in several languages. There are 5 or 6 in English, 2 of which you may have heard of. The Eaters of the Dead by Michael Crichton. And if you haven't heard of that book, you probably heard of the movie The 13th Warrior with Antonio Banderas. That's based on Beowulf. And then a novel called Grendel by John Gardner, a famous novelist, and that novel is really stupendous. When Donnita Rogers submitted her first novel to us, my staff brought it to me and said, would you have a look? And I was skeptical that anything more could be done with Beowulf. And I read the book and I said, let's get all 3. This is an extraordinary look at the poem from the viewpoint of one word in line 2022, expanded into this wonderful exploration of Norse myth and Anglo-Saxon history and women's studies in the very early Germanic period. Donnita Rogers has her doctorate from the University of Minnesota. She braved the winters of Minnesota to get learning, so she obviously has a lot of gumption. She, after 9/11, a month after 9/11, she still took a flight to Italy because it was a long dreamed of trip, and she wasn't going to be intimidated by terrorists. She always takes the lead when taking hold of snakes, or taking the tiller of a boat, or climbing to the top of a pyramid. In a way, she's her own fearless female. So we're really delighted to have her. She's climbed the intimidating mountain of Beowulf scholarship and has descended into the depths of this really amazing literary creation. And it's a pleasure to have her here. Donnita.
Thank you, Bob.
What? We are Dana.
Injerdegum theod kenninga hermia frunan, ute ethellingus ellen foremadan. These are the opening lines in Beowulf, that ancient poem about men and monsters. In Seamus Heaney's translation, this is what we hear. So, the Spear Danes in days gone by, and the kings who ruled them, had courage and greatness. We have heard of those princes' heroic campaigns. But, I would add, what we have not heard is the women's side of the story. Welcome to my talk on the forgotten female in Beowulf, giving voice to Freawaru. And I know that name is a mouthful. Strong women. I've always been drawn to the lives of strong women. Women who stick their necks out, stand up and make their voices heard, refuse to stay on the sidelines. Doing that requires grit, determination, and courage, attributes which don't necessarily come naturally. Usually we learn by experience. Courage is like a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it grows. Looking over the audience tonight, I believe I see many strong women. Like you, in my personal life, I have faced many challenges. Fortunately, I've been able to meet each one successfully. For example, I was unable to conceive a child, so I adopted 4 children. I found I was married to an abusive husband, so I got a divorce. I needed to provide a home for those children, so I built a little house on the San Jacinto River in Texas, partly with my own labor. Then my house was flooded with 2 feet of water, so I tore it apart and rebuilt it. I needed an income to support my daughters, so I opened a bookstore with 3 female partners. After 10 years, the bookstore went bankrupt, so I got a teaching job at the local high school, and that's where my novel began. After teaching honors English for 16 years, I fell in love with Beowulf, with the epic poem Beowulf. And one day in the classroom, I had an epiphany. In the middle of a lecture, in the middle of a sentence, I suddenly stopped and blurted out, "I'm going to write a book about the women of Beowulf." One of my sophomore boys jumped to his feet. "Dr. Rogers," he cried, "I know just what you can call it. The Babes of Beowulf." Thank you, Charles. I give you credit for alliteration. And I did indeed use that as a working title when I began writing what became Faces in the Fire, the first book in a trilogy on the women of Beowulf. Now I'd like to tell you a bit about the world reflected in that epic. As Bob has already told you, the poem was composed in England, perhaps between 700 and 1000 AD. The author is unknown, but was clearly a Christian, perhaps a literate monk in the court of some regional king. But he was recording a pagan world, recalling the glories of the warrior class in the heroic age of Germanic culture, perhaps celebrating ancestors from the long ago past. Now, even though it's written in English, the characters, mostly male, are 6th century Danes, Swedes, and Geats, all men. They battle each other, often over ancient blood feuds, or they seek fame by vanquishing horrible monsters, such as the Grendel monster in Beowulf. Now, in this work, we do not find any details of daily life. There's nothing about the lives of farmers, settlers, craftsmen in their small tribal villages, and almost nothing about their women. I was talking to someone earlier about this, and they said, "Women in Beowulf? I don't remember any." Which is one reason I set out to correct that situation. The epic focuses on a narrow elite, the aristocrats of their day, the 1%, if you will, whose main preoccupation was warfare. In 6th century Scandinavia, communal life centered on the mead hall, a smoky, windowless structure where the warriors drank and celebrated their victories after spring raids, where their tribal chieftain or their king dispensed gold rings and other rewards from the captured loot. No organized religion was practiced, although ritual sacrifices to the gods were held throughout the year, usually during the solstice. Each man and woman was free to make offerings to their favorite god or goddess, perhaps to Odin, to Thor, to Freyr, or to Freya. Now, Freya is my favorite goddess in the Norse pantheon. Strangely enough, we don't teach much about Norse mythology in public school. You get a heavy dose of Greek and Roman mythology. Everyone would probably recognize the goddess of sexual love, of romantic love, in the Greeks as being Aphrodite, who becomes Venus with the Romans. For the Norse, it's Freya. Or the goddess of married love, of home and hearth. In the Greeks, it would be Hera, the wife of Zeus. In the Romans, Juno, the wife of Jupiter. In the Norse, it's going to be Frigga, the wife of Odin. But of all those, it's Freya who is nearest to my heart, who figures prominently in my work. Think about this. She's a fertility goddess. She has the ability to create life. She has a very lusty appetite for sex and gold. I'm not necessarily against either one. And she can do something that I have always wanted to do. She can fly. She can transform herself by donning her magic feather cloak. In other words, she visits other worlds, just as a shaman or a seeress would do in a trance state. And Freawaru herself is going to be called upon to act in that fashion. Going back to the world of our epic, no written language existed among the people at this time, except for the use of runes. An alphabet of 24 straight-line letters, you might call them glyphs, sometimes called the futhark, from the word spelled by the first 6 letters. They were commonly used to mark weapons to show ownership, and to create inscriptions on memorial stones, which are found all over Scandinavia. You practically trip over them when you're traveling, except they're quite big. And sometimes by being cast as omens to look into the future. Without any written language, how do you transmit your history? Stories were passed down orally from generation to generation, often told by the tribal storyteller, called a shope. Beowulf reflects years of oral history, fondly recorded by that someone who could read and write in Old English. I thought you might like to hear some Old English from a context that might be more familiar to you. See if this sounds familiar. Fader ura, susei on helfna, si den nama je helgod, to bekum den riche, je worthet den willa on earthen, swaswa on heofna, urna, je die wam liken, la silis to die and forgifus, ura giltus, swaswa way, forgifus, urum giltendur. En ne je leed to us on kostnung, ek alles us of ifel, sofliche. You recognize the Lord's Prayer? That sofliche is not really an amen, it's more like a so be it kind of expression. Old English is often used to describe the period from about 450 AD to 1100. We also call it Anglo-Saxon. Getting back to our story. What roles did women play in this world? Regardless of their class, whether they were noblewomen, free wives of freemen, or slaves, and slavery was a common and accepted practice of the time. Women, I like to say, held up half the sky back then, just as they do now. First, they provided the basic necessities of food and clothing. Think about this, ladies. Every piece of cloth, every cloak, every blanket, every sail had to be woven at home, so their looms were always busy. But the women in the 5th century, the 6th century, in the epic, did much more than this. I was delighted as I researched to find out how much independence and respect these women were given. They practiced herbal medicine. They were the doctors and nurses of their culture. They defended their homes during attack when the men were off raiding. They could pick up and swing a battle axe as good as any man, although that becomes much more pronounced in later centuries, especially in the Icelandic sagas, where the women are quite violent. Women could make political unions. They could give advice and counsel to their husbands. They could choose their own husbands, and they could divorce them. They had the right to inherit property, and, perhaps most importantly, they kept the keys to the strongbox. Independent and respected women. Some few had special gifts. These were the seeresses, or the shamans, sought out for their advice and predictions. Faces in the Fire tells the story of one such woman, the daughter of King Hrothgar, the young Freawaru. Now there is a female in Beowulf who gets to speak in her own right. That's Freawaru's mother, Queen Wealhtheow. She makes 2 speeches in the epic. One directed to her husband, King Hrothgar, the other to Beowulf himself. In both, she's concerned for the safety of her 2 young sons. No mention is made of the daughter. Some of you may have read Anita Diamante's book, The Red Tent. Much like the heroine of The Red Tent, a woman mentioned only once in the Bible, my heroine, Freawaru, is mentioned only once in the Beowulf epic, and Bob gave you the actual line number of that, but then only as an afterthought. In the passage I'm about to read, Beowulf has killed the Grendel monster at the Danish court and returned to his home in Geatland, where he's reporting to his own king. Again, I'm reading from Seamus Heaney's translation. Sometimes Hrothgar's daughter distributed ale to the older ranks in order on the benches. I heard the company call her Freawaru as she made her rounds, presenting men with the gem-studded bowl. A young bride-to-be to the gracious Ingeld in her gold-trimmed attire. The friend of the Scyldings favors her betrothal. The guardian of the kingdom sees good in it, and hopes this woman will heal old wounds and grievous feuds. But generally the spear is prompt to retaliate when a prince is killed, no matter how admirable the bride may be. End of translation. Beowulf goes on to envisage the old feud between tribes being reignited, and he foresees grim consequences in this proposed marriage. Then he returns to his account of the fight with the Grendel monster, and we hear no more about Freawaru in the entire remainder of the epic. Well, talk about a story that needed telling. Freawaru clearly had to become my heroine. So I made her the central character. She lives and tells the events of the epic in her own words, first person. Here, for example, is her version of the first attack of the Grendel monster on her father's mead hall, Heorot. This is an excerpt from chapter 2 entitled Up from the Swamp. When I was a girl of 6 winters, my childhood came to a sudden end. It was night, the night of the year's turning, the longest and darkest of all nights. That night, every freeman in the settlement crowded into Heorot to gorge himself on roasted boar flesh and drank deeply from Hrothgar's golden cups. Even I had been allowed a taste of mead. Its heavy sweetness still lay on my tongue, weighed down my eyelids. After the singing and carousing late into the night, the last stragglers had staggered away, leaving only Father's hall guard inside. All was quiet. In the women's house, we lay sleeping. I had crept away from my nurse's bed to escape her snores, and now lay curled close to my mother, her belly big with child. A sudden shriek tore open the womb of silence. Another cry, another. A horrible din, as if spears and shields were gnashing their teeth in full battle rage, as Aelric, our Shope, later described it. Ripped awake by the savage cries, I struggled to free myself from the bed covers. In her haste to rise, Mother rolled over me, crushing my cheek into the sleeping robe. Other women were springing up, bleary-eyed in the light of the hearth fire. I cried out, but no one heeded me. A great roar seemed to shake the very timbers of the house. We froze in our places. Then came a long, triumphant cry, a sound like gurgling laughter from a mouth filled with blood. Wide-eyed with terror, we screamed and screamed, then held our breath listening for more, but no sound came. For a moment, no one moved. Suddenly, everyone turned to Mother, who responded firmly, her voice filled with authority. "Stay inside. There's danger in the darkness. Gita, see to the door. Be sure it's barred. Britta, stir up the fire. We'll need light. Willa, go to Freawaru. Whatever has happened, Hrothgar's hall guard will deal with it." Her words were strong, but her voice broke as she spoke. I whimpered as my old wet nurse gathered me in her arms and pressed me to her heaving bosom. I wiggled free to run to Mother and cling to her, shivering. I felt an answering quiver in her thigh. Then a gush of wetness soaked the side of my night shift. Mother inhaled sharply and bent nearly double. "My water! It's broken! Willa, quick, it's time! Danger or no danger, this baby wants to come out. It's seeking the door into our world. Build up the fire. Light torches. Set water to boil. Fetch mugwort from my shelf and mallow, should it be needed." Shaking with fear, I watched in confusion as the women hurried to do her bidding. Willa pried loose my fingers and eased Mother onto her sleeping bench, momentarily forgotten at the terrible cries from the darkness. A darkness, now eerily silent. That night changed my life and my dreams forever. Never again would the swans come to bear me aloft. Never again would I feel safe in my mother's love and secure in the might of my father's hall. Though we did not know it then, our living nightmare had begun. The house of Hrothgar would be plunged into misery and dark despair. During her young life, Freawaru must face many challenges. For example, she must learn how to master the gift she's been given by the goddess Freya, the ability to see into the future, sometimes. She is threatened by her sly and lecherous older cousin, and she's challenged by her mysterious rune master, who may be a madman. On her broader stage, she's challenged to act as a peace weaver between tribes, marrying that rival chieftain mentioned by Beowulf. When she does, in her new husband's hall, she faces a mother-in-law who wishes her dead, unless she can produce a son. Growing up female in a Viking world of men and monsters is a tall order for any girl. Fortunately, Freawaru has grit, guts, determination. She's not without fear, but she faces her fears squarely. In order to give an accurate portrayal of Freawaru's 6th century world, I spent 5 years researching in books and libraries. Then I traveled to Scandinavia to visit the locales thought to be the actual sites of events in the epic. And I'll show them to you now. In Denmark, as you can see, we have Zealand, the island. The town, this is a modern town of Roskilde. It's the ancient settlement called Gamla Lera, and Bob may correct my pronunciation later. And the reconstructed fort at Trelleborg. In Sweden, Fjällbacka and Göteborg are thought to be the area of the gates that Beowulf hung out in. Here is the reconstructed deed hall at Trelleborg in Zealand, Denmark. It's quite large. I don't know how many it would actually hold because it's only a reconstruction, but you'll see in a moment that it is not very well appointed inside. Here is a typical sleeping bench. They ranged along the sides of the walls. There's going to be a hearth in the center, and then tables could be set up around the hearth and across from the benches, put up when they're not using them for food. so that you can have a sleeping space. It's fairly primitive, but of course the king's mead hall would be the best of the lot. The sacrificial bog. Can anybody tell what they're sacrificing? I'll give you a close-up. Horses. After the sacrifice, we were talking about this, strangely enough, at dinner earlier tonight. The good parts of the meat were eaten by the people doing the sacrifice, and the rest was hung out as an offering to the gods. So here are the horse hides and the skulls in a very convincing bog, yes, Gamla in Denmark. The women go to a separate place, to their own sacred pool, and they're worshiping the goddess. And I thought this one filled the bill rather remarkably. Also in Gamla. There's a little, almost a dock to step out on. And I've actually used each of these places as specific locations in the novel. So you're seeing what inspired my own imagination. This is a tree. I photoshopped out the child that was climbing in it and used it as the schoolroom. This is the place where Freawaru sits to learn runes from her rune master, Wealhtheow, who was an actual character in the original epic. This is a wonderful place in the southern part of Zealand called Månsklint. I called it Mooncliff in English. A vast chalk cliff. I think it's much more dramatic than the cliffs of Dover in England. And there are falcons nesting there. So of course I had to use that in the story. Another view looking from the beach. Tribal locations in 6th century Scandinavia, again the Geats, the Danes, and the Heathobards. The Heathobards are the Germanic tribes that she's marrying into. Ingeld is the chief of that group. And the Danes lived pretty much all over modern Denmark, plus the lower part of Sweden is part of Denmark at that time too. I found these in a museum, and I thought, oh, these would make perfect wedding clothes for Freawaru and Ingeld. So in the book, she's wearing this blue tunic. By the way, when you see stereotypical images of Viking women, aside from the horns that aren't at all appropriate, they often have these large breastplates. Well, that perhaps came about because the women did wear large brooches to hold up their tunics. There were straps coming around from the back, and then the brooches held them up. And those were a common gift to a young woman when she became of age. And the men have leggings and trousers and cloaks. You always had the cloak over one shoulder so that the other shoulder was free to draw your sword, so there wouldn't be any encumbrance in doing so. Oh, they're very fond of burning each other's longhouses down. And at one point in the story, there's going to be a major fire. And that's not an actual photograph. This is a bird's eye view of the countryside around Gamla, where it is thought that Heorot could be located, the seat of the Scylding kings, King Hrothgar and his court. Quite beautiful country. Well, it's possible that Freawaru may not fare too well in her new husband's homeland, and she might have to seek out a new home. Where is she going to go? I actually got to crew on a Viking ship one afternoon. It was a reconstruction of a ship out of Roskilde Harbor. And you could pay your money as a tourist and help row out and then hoist the sail and then row back when it was time to return. So I had the experience of putting my shoulders to the oars. stop at that picture. As I was working, I discovered that I needed a larger scope to tell Freawaru's story than just one book. So the novel became a trilogy. Book 1, Faces in the Fire, is set in Denmark and follows the initial events in the first half of the Beowulf epic. That book was first published by an internet publisher, iUniverse, but was later taken up by Bagwin Books of Arizona State, the sponsor of tonight's talk and of the whole Fearless Females series. When I heard about this series, I said, I want to come and talk about Freawaru, and they graciously accepted. Book 2, Fanning the Flames, is scheduled for publication in May of this year, so you won't have long to wait to find out what happens next. People have been pestering me for years now. When is the next book coming out? Well, it's coming. That book is set in Sweden and completes the events in the original epic. Now there's book 3, which is underway as I speak. I'm going to England later this month to do more research on the locations. And parts of that book also take place in Norway. All 3 books feature Freawaru as the central character. In writing these books, I've had 3 major goals. First, I wanted to immerse the reader in 6th century pre-Viking life. Hence, all the information about customs and rituals and herbs and beliefs, everything I could glean in 5 years of library research. Next, I wanted to take the somewhat haphazardly presented events of the Beowulf epic, which are not in strict chronological order, and set them in order so the reader can make sense of them. I know scholars have a great time discussing why certain things are discussed in what order. I thought for the purposes of fiction, you need to have a straightforward narrative. And finally, there are many puzzling events in the original, which I thought required some explanation. What could motivate people to do what they did? Take one example, the Unfair character, who is the rune master for Freawaru. We know from the epic that he has killed his own brothers. Now, kin killing was a major crime in that culture, and yet he is treated with great respect and even seems to be the king's spokesperson. How to account for that? As the author, I got to come up with my own solution for that situation. I will close with a personal anecdote about one of my adventures in Scandinavia. After I flew to Copenhagen and took a train to Roskilde, Denmark, I went to pick up the rental car I'd reserved online. To my horror, the Volvo station wagon had a stick shift. I had not driven a stick shift since I was a girl on the farm in Indiana. Nervously, with the agent coaching me from the passenger seat, I drove around the block several times till I finally got the hang of it. You can imagine us lurching back and forth. And off I went, blithely driving around the island of Zealand and ultimately across the Channel Bridge into Sweden. During my travels, I stayed in a variety of youth hostels, one night in a Pullman train car, one night in a rehab jail cell. Then it came time to return the rental car in Stockholm. I'd never been to Stockholm. I had an address but no city map. So what to do? Spotting a tour bus parked by the harbor, I stopped and asked the driver if he had a map. Not only did he have a map, he found the address I needed, and it was only a few blocks away. Now, I did drive the wrong way down a one-way street to get there, but I did return the Volvo safely to the agency. Mission accomplished. Thank you for your attention. So